Hi, welcome to More Christ. My name is Marcus. I'm joined today by Dr. Christopher Watkin. Christopher is a senior lecturer in French studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He's a scholar with an international reputation in modern and contemporary European thought, atheism, and the relationship between the Bible and philosophy. His published work runs the spectrum from academic monographs and contemporary philosophy to books written for general readers, both Christian and secular. They include difficult atheism from Plato to postmodernism, great thinkers, Jacques Derrida, and others. Today, however, I want to focus especially on his brilliant new book, Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. So, just to begin, then, Chris, what moved you to write this book? And I suppose, what do you hope readers will ultimately take away from it then?
Thank you, Marcus. Good evening from Melbourne. Lovely to be with you. And yeah, look, it's quite a long gestation period, I guess. This book it started being something that I had an inkling to write as an undergraduate, and it came out of the frustration of living really in two somewhat disconnected worlds at that point. So there was the world of my studies, which was very theory heavy. Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, Derrida, Foucault, feminism, queer theory, all the theories. And then there was the church I was attending on Sunday, which was a thoroughly Bible-believing church, teaching us to read the Bible slowly and carefully and to ponder its meaning, apply it to our life. And they were both exhilarating worlds to be in, but there wasn't really much of a crossover between them. There wasn't a conversation where the Bible could bring its own insights about human nature and about the world and society to the table. And, you could sort of compare what the Bible has to say about these key human issues with what these theories were saying. And so that was really the as James would say, the Anstoß, the propelling factor that got me going. But I had no idea at that point about how to write a book like that. And it was only when I did my first Bible overview and I realized, and I'm sure this is a very common experience of people who do their first Bible overview, oh my goodness, why has nobody told me this before? The whole Bible is one powerful, coherent narrative that makes sense of the whole of reality, including myself, and that you can sort of live inside and gives a shape to reality. And so that was the first penny that dropped, that the power of understanding the Bible as one whole narrative. And then the second piece of the jigsaw that came into place that helped me to see how I could possibly write a book that might do what I wanted it to do was reading Augustine's City of God for the first time on a rainy week in Bridlington, as almost all of them are, on a summer holiday with my parents. I can't remember exactly why I took the City of God with me. I think it's one of the books that you feel you ought to have read. It's one of those sort of worthy books that you think probably before I die, I need to read this at some point. And anyway, I plowed through it that week and most of it went straight over my head. But the bits that I did understand were just electrifying. So here was this 5th century Christian who was taking a Bible overview framework in the second half of the City of God, going through from Genesis to Revelation, but using that framework as a way to critique late Roman society in just the deepest and most incisive way imaginable. And using that biblical storyline as a series of lenses that really bring Roman society into a focus that it can't even achieve when it's thinking about itself. He understands Rome better than the Romans through this Bible overview framework. And so from that point on, I knew, well, if I do write a book like this, that's the pattern that I want to try and follow. That's the blazing sun to which I want to try and hold a little flickering candle. And that's what I've tried to do. So in biblical critical theory, I just go through from Genesis to Revelation, trying to read culture through those different moments in the biblical story.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And how then does this book compare and contrast with more popular notions of critical theory? So I think, as you've mentioned before, it's not your usual Frankfurt School tract, for example, or what's become more fashionable in popular culture, this kind of CRT that people talk about. In my opinion, it's actually much more radical. Would you like to speak to that and how the Bible offers that different perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much. You're right. There are different senses of critical theory. The one that I knew from the mid-90s until quite recently was this broader sense. So as an undergraduate, we did a unit called Modern Critical Theory. And it wasn't a unit about the Frankfurt School. I don't recall Adorno and Horkheimer even being in the unit. There was a week on Foucault, a week on Derrida, a week on feminism, if I remember correctly, a week on queer theory, and so forth. And it was a series of theoretical approaches to reality that generated social critique. So that was what I understood critical theory to be, for a couple of decades. And I think what's sort of sucking up the oxygen in the news media at the moment and getting called critical theory is a variant of that, but it's not the whole ballgame. And there's a danger if we just focus on Frankfurt School critical theory, or even if we just focus on critical race theory and think that that's the only critical theoretical approach abroad in society, that you end up sort of missing the wood for the trees and not realizing that things like critical race theory exist in an ecosystem of ideas. They don't just parachute into a society from nowhere. And nor can they really be addressed in isolation from the broader theoretical movements going on in society. So I guess that raises the question then, well, if my definition of critical theory is so broad, then how do you understand what a critical theory is? Is everything a critical? And a definition that I found really helpful over the years is to understand a critical theory as doing three things primarily. It's making certain things in the world viable, visible, and valuable. Viable in the sense of you can believe them. They become possible in the world. And, a classic example of this would be for people who've read a lot of Marx, revolution seems a thing that's possible. It can appear in the world, even inevitable on some readings. And if you hadn't read a lot of Marx, you might think, oh, that's just fanciful. That's just ridiculous. They could never be anything. And then secondly, critical theories make things visible. Bless you. They draw your attention to things out there in the world and things in our own makeup that we wouldn't have realized otherwise. And again, a great example of this would be feminism and the way that many feminisms draw our attention to the way in which women are oppressed and treated differently to men in society, in a way that if your attention hadn't been drawn, you might not notice. They might just pass under the radar. So it's making those things visible, making them stand out. And thirdly, critical theories make things valuable. They teach you, catechize you really, in what to commend in society, what to celebrate, and what to condemn as well. And the combined effect of those three things is it gives you a perspective from which to critique the status quo. So you can look out onto society and you can say, I know what's wrong with it, and I know what a better society would look like. That's the sort of perspective a critical theory gives you. But then if you sort of turn to the Bible and you consider the Bible in those terms, you find that it's doing a very similar thing. And it's not only doing this, of course. The Bible makes us wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. It's God-breathed. It's useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness. All of that, it's the sword of the Spirit. And I don't mean what I say to water down any of that. But in addition to all of that, and in a way that dovetails with it as well, the Bible is also making certain things in the world viable. So, for example, if you went up to most people on the street today and said, have you had a go at trusting God's promises? They would just laugh at you. Like there's no category for that. There's no way of looking in the world in which that makes sense for most people today. And yet you read the Bible over time, thinking about it, and you gradually come to the position, by God's grace, where you can say, I can see how trusting this sort of God would make sense. I can see how that wouldn't be a stupid thing to do. And the Bible makes certain things in the world visible as well. So I'm looking out of my window now, and there's a beautiful Melbourne sunset in the background. And if I hadn't ever read the psalm that says the heavens declare the glory of God, I might never have made that link. I might have just thought, oh, that's pretty. But I'm taught by the Bible to see the glory of God in the scene that's before me at the moment. It's making it visible for me. And similarly, the Bible teaches us what to value. So I might never, and indeed had never, before I became a Christian, considered that serving other people might be something that I would desire, that would be valuable to me. But I can't really read 2 pages in the New Testament without being confronted with the idea that Jesus came to serve, and he wants his followers to be people who serve as well. So it's teaching me what to value, what to desire, what to covet in that sense in society. And in that way, the Bible is acting as a critical theory, very different sort of critical theory from the secular ones, but it's making those same moves. It's acting upon us in similar ways.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And I'm not sure if I can add anything to that, but I made a few notes that I think ties it in with my little corner of the internet, as it were. So I'll just see if this makes sense to you. So I think from my perspective, it answers the questions in line with what you said, raised by people like Charles Taylor regarding this plausibility in a dominant secular culture and what's kind of popularly called the meaning crisis in some parts of the internet. And I think it does that in part, in line again with what you said, by refocusing our attention on what really matters. And I think reminding us of the importance of even attention itself. You talk about that tripartite structure, which I think is most helpful, and what spectacles we're actually seeing the world through. And I think that when I say it's very radical, I think it's radical in part because it exposes some of those dominant secular myths of things like neutrality and draws our attention to those important questions and areas. So yeah, I most appreciate that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Could I just put a footnote on what you just said? Because I think it's really, really helpful. And so I agree with everything you've just said. And because it does all that, it reading the Bible shows us that things like the crisis of meaning and the plausibility structures of contemporary society are not necessary. There's nothing obvious about them. We're catechized into them.
Mm-hmm.
Society works really hard to get us to a point, knowingly or unknowingly, where there is a crisis of meaning and where believing in God is implausible. And therefore, these positions are both geographically and historically quite situated and local. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing necessary, there's nothing inevitable about them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. I hear that fatalism constantly. And again, I think your book is most helpful in deconstructing that, as it were. And I want to look at part of your book now. There's a lovely quote about your experience in the church, actually, near the beginning of the book, if I might share that. So you say, it was at church and among my Christian friends that I first discovered faith, not as a set of ideas to believe, but as a true story of the whole universe, a true tale of love, promise, and costly rescue in which we all play a role. Can you tell us a bit about that and one or two key moments on your journey along the Christian way then?
Yeah, I'd love to. The first Bible overview is absolutely key. So I was about 19, I think, at that point. I was a junior leader on a Church of England youth camp, a Cypher camp. And part of the junior leader program was that we had, I think it was 3 teaching sessions every day, and one of them was a Bible overview. And it was the way in which, so we followed Graham Goldsworthy's pattern of God's people in God's place, under God's blessing and rule, and took that from Genesis 1 to Revelation 21. And it was just mind-blowing how the whole of the Bible, written over hundreds of years by different writers in different cultural contexts, in different languages, for crying out loud, told this cumulative, coherent story about God bringing his people into his place under his rule. And it's just, I think it's compelling for a number of reasons. It's compelling because it shows how the biblical documents, diverse though they are superintended by God in order to unfold this coherent, though diverse and complex vision of reality. And it's compelling, I think, as well, because in the words of a book that I came across recently, we are storied animals, aren't we? We live through and in terms of stories, whether we can articulate what those stories are or not. And I think one of the problematic aspects of modern society is that often we can't articulate the stories that drive us and that govern us. But that's another story. But the idea is that we make sense of our life through stories. Even before we've read the Bible, there's nothing unique to the Bible about this. And yet this particular story, first of all, happens to be true, but also is the richest, most nuanced, deepest account that I'd come across and still have come across for making sense of all the riotous complexity of human beings and the befuddling complexity of the world in which we live. Just to take one example, the way in which the Bible conjures with both what Pascal would call the greatness and the wretchedness of human beings. We're made in the image of God. There's an unparalleled dignity and weightiness to human beings in that. But then we've all turned our back on God. And so, when human beings commit some of the most abominable crimes, the Christian is not sort of rocked in her worldview. She's saddened, she grieves, but she's not, it doesn't come as a challenge to her view of the world, because the biblical view builds in both the soaring heights to which humans are capable and the execrable depths to which we plunge in a way that's really quite rare in a view of the world. And it's just facts like that just sort of accumulated throughout doing this Bible overview and after. And the cumulative effect of that, I think, is just like, Paul in his letters, when he just breaks off a little moment of praise, you've just got to stop at some point, as you're just getting insight upon insight upon insight into the human condition and into the world in which we live. You just got to stop and praise God for his wisdom, because it really is quite astounding.
Amen. Thank you for sharing, Chris. And I think another element of the radical nature of your book that I love is the return to the focus on the Trinity. And I think, again, that frees us from what you described before as the kind of reification of some of these secularist categories, and also oftentimes the black and white manner in which I think the kind of dichotomies, you go through a series of dichotomies of the world events. Say Marx has the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but you can take the positive, plunder the Egyptians is the right term from the Bible. And my friend Jonathan Bajot was talking about this about Exodus recently, which I think ties in nicely. And also avoid the pitfalls of someone like Marx and things like that. So I suppose, to use your own question and from the book, what difference does the Trinity make to the way that we think, that we feel and live in the world? And how does that differ from some of the kind of popular origin stories, so to speak? If that makes sense.
We've got 5 hours, haven't we? Because that's how long this is going to take. Let me just hit a couple of high points, because that is a question that launches 1,000 sermons, isn't it? What difference does it makes every difference in the world in a very concrete sense, I think, because where you start determines what is possible and what is normative. And so if you start with an abstract principle, or if you start with matter, time, and chance, as Francis Schaeffer was fond of saying, or if you start with energy or whatever it is, if you start with an impersonal principle, then the personal is only ever going to be an excrescence in reality and an ephemeral curiosity, like a wave, like foam on a wave that appears for a certain time and then just dies away with no fundamental meaning beyond that which the personal might ascribe to itself, which itself is necessarily ephemeral. But if you begin with a Trinity, which is where the Bible begins, you have at least 4 blindingly refreshing and I think socially really healthy starting points to build on. The first is what theologians call the creator-creature distinction. So God is not part of the created universe. And among the many, many differences that makes, one of them is that you have a reference point outside the status quo by which to judge the status quo. So you're not bootstrapping yourself to ethical principles. There is an authoritative voice that pronounces not only it was so, but it was good in Genesis 1. And the impact of that on social theory, I think, is unimaginably large. So there's a creator-creature distinction. Then there's what theologians, particularly John Frame, in my reading, calls absolute personality theism, which is the idea that the God of the Bible is both absolute in the sense that he's outside creation, he's not contingent, he doesn't rely on anything outside himself to be who he is, but he's also personal. God is not a force or a principle. God presents himself in the pages of the Bible as someone who can be reasoned with, someone who speaks, all the qualities of personality. And Frame points out that you get some religions that have absolute gods, Aristotle's prime mover, and you get some religions that have personal gods, the Greek and Roman pantheon. And now I know Greek and Roman scholars that there is a principle, an absolute principle of everything, but it's not the same as the pantheon. And so that there's still this distinction in these traditions. But in the biblical God, you have both absoluteness and personality together. And again, we could talk for hours about the implications of that. One implication that I love because I teach in the arts and humanities is that God's absoluteness grounds the sciences, as we're quite fond of saying as Christians, that there is law, there is predictability in the universe because God is constant. But we're not quite so keen or aware, perhaps sometimes, that God's personality grounds the humanities. And because the fundamental reality in our universe is personal, there is a dignity and a weight and a meaningfulness to personality that means that the study of the expressions of personality artistically and in literature has something equally important about it as the study of the scientific universe. So that's just one implication of absolute personality theism. There's no battle between the sciences and the arts because God is both equally, and those two principles are not in tension in him. The third way in which the Trinity makes a difference is precisely in the Trinitarian nature of God. So this absolute personality, God is not only one person, but as the Christian tradition has come to understand it, one God in three persons. And one of the differences that makes, and it's just the most delicious, freeing, liberating, invigorating difference that you can possibly think of for society, is that relationships are not latecomers to the game in our universe, that there is a relationality and a relationality between persons that is at the very core of the reality in which we inhabit, that deeper than which nothing is relational. And therefore there's again a dignity and importance, a priority to being related that perhaps is a word that we need to hear today in the environmental movement. Genesis 1 is very strong on the relationship that Adam and Eve have to the rest of the world, created on the same day as the animals, given a task by God to care for the world. And I think part of the environmental crisis that we're facing is that we've lost that idea of fundamental irreducible relationality. That, we see ourselves first of all as atomized individuals who then happen to be in various relationships, but you can sort of take them or leave them. You can't for the Bible, because God himself is irreducibly relational, and Genesis 1 and 2, I think, make it clear that he's created us as irreducibly relational beings in all sorts of directions, with him, with each other, with the animals and livestock, with the inanimate world and on. And the fourth huge difference that it makes is that the relationships that God enjoys between the three persons of the Trinity are not generic relationships in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say God related to himself before the creation of the world. It gives a content and a texture to those relationships. And the word that it uses more than any other is love. Think of Christ's high priestly prayer in John 17, the love with which you loved me before the creation of the world. Time and time again, when the Bible sort of pulls back the curtain and gives us a peek into what God was like before he created the universe, that the word that keeps coming back again and again and again is love. And again, you could write volumes on the implications of that for social theory and for our understanding of ourselves. And one of the main ones that I try to pull out in the book is that it gives you an ontology, if you like, of love, an ontology grounded in love, where love is more fundamental than, for example, violence, which stands in really stark contradistinction to the primary ontologies of modernity, which do tend to privilege violence over love. And John Milbank is very good on this in the opening chapters of Theology and Social Theory, where he traces an ontology of violence through Hobbes and Nietzsche and others. And it's chalk and cheese living in a world where the fundamental reality, when you stripped everything else back and got rid of all the intermediary steps, is love, and a reality where when you stripped everything back, what you get back to is violence. Two very different worlds to live in, and two very different bases upon which to construct an understanding of society. So that's a postage stamp version of what difference does the Trinity make. We could go on, but I don't want to try your listeners' patience any further than that.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And of course, they can read the book to find out more. I hope they do. And I think from my perspective too, even as an interesting point, one of the most, or two of the most popular conversations I've had on my channel in terms of the number of views have been with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who's not a kind of Orthodox Christian, and he has this metaphysical kind of idealist picture of the world, and he's very good at critiquing materialism. But I think your book highlights the flaws and implicit assumptions in his worldview that even though he's well-intentioned, that they don't lend itself to that healthy balance of the personal and the absolute together, because there's a sense that I got, and pardon me if I'm misinterpreting it here, but that there's an elevation of nature in this kind of absolute way, and we're meant to conform to our kind of nature rising from below. And I just didn't find that convincing, as much as I respect him and think he's got many good points. I wondered why we would obey one part of nature over others, and what timescales are we going to play with, and whose authority is that that we must obey these things. So I think your work is most helpful in adding nuances even upon the more nuanced critiques of materialism. Does that make sense, though, what I'm saying there?
Yeah, it does. I haven't read the work of the gentleman you mentioned, so I don't want to say anything about his approach specifically. But I think it's really hard, for the reasons that you say, to get a normative perspective on reality from within nature, because nature is so varied, and you can sort of find pretty much whatever you want in there. You can find a nice, fluffy, caring nature. You can find a rapacious, bloodthirsty nature. And in the book, I try to make the point that, we talk quite readily sometimes about sacred groves and so forth, but no one ever mentions sacred mass extinction events. And yet, if nature is all there is, then those are on a level. There's nothing to privilege life above death necessarily within the natural world itself. We may have a drive to life, but that's just in itself not normative. It's just the way that things have turned out. And it could well have been that there'd been no life at all, and that wouldn't have been worse. That would have just been what there is. So it's really hard to get norms out of nature that transcend what we feel, if you like. It's really easy to say, I think life's better than death. Absolutely. I think almost all of us do most of the time, and that's a very valid feeling. But it's a very different kettle of fish to say, and I think that is actually a reality that transcends my feeling. I think life is better than death for everybody at all times, and in a way that's not just me feeling it. That's really hard.
Mhm. Absolutely. And one of his concerns was his background in kind of computer science was he thought that we were often anthropomorphizing the universe, but from what I can see reading your book, it's just as equally plausible that he's projecting his view of absolutes onto the universe and ignoring the evidence that would suggest God's personal interaction with the world. And not just him. I don't want to mean to just I'm just using that as an example of some of the things that I hear people say, if that makes sense. And I think your book is most helpful in that.
Yeah. So again, I haven't read his work, so I'm not going to dare to comment on his view generally, but to take the more general view, there's something inevitable about anthropomorphizing the universe because we have to find language to speak about it that we understand, and our language has grown up in human contexts. But I think there's also something theologically really interesting about it, which is that we are in the image of a God who made the universe, whose glory the heavens declare. So there is something, I mean, you can take it too far, but there is something theologically appropriate about describing the universe in not theomorphic necessarily. I think that's a clumsy word because it makes it sound as though God is the same as the universe, which of course he's not, but in language that sees the universe as a window through which we apprehend something of God's glory, whatever word you want to use for that, theosymbolic or whatever, theosacramental world. And so I don't think as Christians we do want to completely strip all anthropomorphic language from our description of the universe. I don't think the Bible does that either. But if you aren't a Christian, then I guess you probably, and you're a modern person, you probably feel the need to do that because it would be a catachresis not to. It would be a false ascription of human qualities to a material reality that that perhaps you feel is inert and you know not doesn't resonate with human concerns. This is Albert Camus, isn't it? And his idea of the absurd. Like, here we are, humans in the world. We demand meaning. We can't live without meaning. It's just existentially impossible. And yet we're confronted with a world that resists our meaning at every point. You know, the universe doesn't shed a tear when a child dies in agony. It doesn't care. It's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It just happens for the universe. And that's something that we as humans, Camus argues, can't tolerate. So I think that's a real problem if you don't have God, because in a sense, you're caught in a Beckettian bind. You know, I can't go on, I must go on. I can't anthropomorphize, I must anthropomorphize, because I can't speak about anything unless I use categories that are at least latently human. So, you know, what do you do?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. And I think another element that's wonderfully subversive about your book is the emphasis on sin and our nature as sinners in really surprising ways, I suppose, for modern people. So I might ask you, how does acknowledging and wrestling with the reality of sin and our status as sinners, of course, amongst other things, then transform society, notions of autonomy, and even anthropology, as we're kind of hinting at here?
Yeah. I was quite surprised when I wrote the chapters on sin as to how socially, now this is going to sound weird, and I'm going to circle back and qualify how socially healthy sin is. I can imagine your listeners going, "What? That's outrageous. Are you saying sin is good for society?" Let me put your minds at rest immediately, dear listeners, and say, no, I'm not saying sin is good. It would be much better off if none of us sinned. It would be a much better world without sin. But what sin does is it puts everyone on the same level before God. And, you know, people like Dante are really good on this. He has, I think it's Canto 19 of the Inferno. He puts some popes in hell. And we might think, oh, you know, that's just a bit of satire. But no, it's a really, really important theological point. Like, everybody from the Pope down is on exactly the same level, needing God's grace. We all sin. Sin is a great leveler Historians have spoken of the democracy of sin. It doesn't matter how much money you've got, doesn't matter how much influence you've got, doesn't matter how powerful you are, your sin levels you with everyone else before God. You can't buy your way out of it. You can't think your way out of it. You have to come to God for grace. And that is socially really healthy because it undermines all the contingent hierarchies of earthly society and of what Augustine would call the earthly city. We can pretend that some people are better than others, and we can use riches as an index of personal worth and what have you. But when you come down to it, as Job says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will return. We're all the same, and that's one thing that sin secures. Another one, and this is an argument of C.S. Lewis, is a really contrarian argument, is that sin is great fuel of democracy. And he's got this brilliant passage in one of his journalistic pieces where he says, most people believe in democracy because they think human beings are really, really good, and we ought to be ruling ourselves. And then he does one of his characteristic moves and he says, I believe in democracy for precisely the opposite reason. Yeah. Because no one is good enough to be in charge. So we got to spread power around because we're all sinners. And I think there's something that really resonates about that, whether they be from the left or right. There's a propensity in all leaders and in all regimes over time to grow fat with power and to abuse power. And the more it's spread around and the more checks and balances there are, to use that famous phrase, the more any one person's sin is hemmed in by the sins of others that are not quite the same and that constrain it in different ways. I think the better society is. So democracy and equality, I think, are both served by the reality of sin. And just finally on that, there are two tendencies, perhaps, at least two tendencies in modern society. There's a tendency towards cynicism, and you see it a lot on Twitter. I see it a lot on Twitter. And, you hear it down the pub. It's this idea that, everybody's the same. All the politicians are crooks. Society is never going to change. I'm just going to do my own thing because there's no point. And you also hear in society sort of a wild-eyed optimism. If only we can get education right, if only we can get the right people in power, often the argument goes, then we can create something approximating a paradise on earth. Now, nobody puts it that way because it sounds so naive, but that's what it boils down to. We can fix society if we get the right people in charge. And what sin and the concomitant doctrines of creation and redemption do for the Christian is that they make her more sober than the worst cynic. So the cynic is saying, everybody's a crook. The Christian says, that's not half of it. The problem isn't out there in society with them. The problem is actually in my heart. It's me. I'm also the problem. And it's not something that I can educate my way out of or get out of in any way. The problem is much worse than you realize, dear cynic. And so there's a bleakness to the Christian outlook. But the Christian also is more utopian than the most wild-eyed optimist, because however well the optimist thinks we're going to run society, nobody's out there saying everything that was done in secret will be brought out into the open and God will wipe every tear from their eyes and there'll be no more mourning, crying or pain because the old order of things will have passed away. Like, that's just off the scale idealistic, that no crime that's been committed in secret will go unaccounted for. Like, nobody is saying that. And so that the Christian finds herself in this amazing position of being more sober than the bleakest, pub cynic, and more utopian than the most wild-eyed optimist, in a way that neither of those things clash with each other. It's not that like you've got to tone down the cynicism to get the optimism. And the idea that we are made in the image of God, profoundly sinful, and yet so loved by God that he sent his son, that whoever believes in him might not perish but have eternal life, gives you this just wild combination of realism and optimism, that it's crazy. It's a crazy ride, so to speak, to have that combination. And I think it's also profoundly healing and peace bringing, because these two sects of the cynics and the optimists clash, and there's so much friction. Again, on Twitter is one of the main places that I encounter it, but also around and about in society, and it needn't be so. Sober realism need not be the enemy of idealism, and the Bible, biblical anthropology, shows how that is the case.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Chris. And I think it speaks to part of why I find, and I think many people find, someone like my friend Jonathan Pajot so helpful in his work in the symbolic world. He's showing how Christ stretches these categories and constantly deconstructs a little like abstract, this is it, common conceptions. And I think the scriptures, as you suggest, in their overall arc, would do a wonderful job of conveying that. And I think there's an interesting moment now that seems to be coming after the kind of heyday of the new atheists and their responses to kind of biblical fundamentalists. And a lot of that was focused on the Old Testament and reading those in very literalistic ways. And it's all about rules for ancient Israel and things like that. And missing, it's always, like you said, the forest for the trees. So I suppose if I might use that as a springboard to ask you about some of the misconceptions of the Old Testament, and how do these stories like that of Noah and Babel figure in your ultimate thesis then, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a huge question, isn't it? A really important one. Let's think. I think we can probably only do either one of Noah or Babel. Shall we do Babel? The idea, I think it's important in terms of the overall development of the biblical storyline, because the motif that it introduces of what Augustine calls in the City of God an earthly city that's set up in opposition to God remains part of the biblical storyline right up until the end of Revelation, where you've got Babylon popping up again. So it's what Babel introduces, this idea of a city that is made for the glory of human beings. Let us make a name for ourselves. Let us build a tower that reaches up to heaven. And this is constantly, often overtly and sometimes implicitly contrasted with the heavenly Jerusalem, with the city that God is building. And so, in Genesis 11, the tower builders say, let's make a name for ourselves. What does God say to Abraham in Genesis 12? I will make your name great. So the problem is not having a great name. There's nothing in the Bible that says you mustn't have a great name, but it's the means to that end. It's whether you're going to try and make your name great in God's world with the gifts that he's given you in a way that ignores him, or whether you're going to let yourself be written into God's plan in a way that he is the one who lifts up, those who trust in him. And so Babel is absolutely fundamental to that two cities reading of Genesis, of the whole Bible. And it introduces some themes, I think, that are really resonant for contemporary society. The idea of making a name for ourselves, of making a spectacle that puts us on the map. That's what Babel is trying to do. Everybody for miles around is going to know us because of this tower. This tower is going to make a name for us. Well, in a sense, you couldn't really get more contemporary than that. And one of the main arenas in which this Babelian project is happening today, not the only one, but one of the main ones is in social media, where we're curating identities for ourselves that seek to make a name for ourselves in really tangible ways, garnering likes and follows and everything else. In a way that is self-creating in the same way that the Babelian project was self-creating. But one of the wonderful ways in which this storyline is subverted later in the Bible, the whole idea of, Babel being something that's lifted up to make a name for ourselves, is the counter spectacle of the cross, where Christ is lifted up in a way that, and I go into this in the book in ways that I don't think I can reconstruct quickly in an oral mode here. But it's the ultimate counter spectacle. It is the opposite of a self-aggrandizing sort of push for power, which Babel was. It is a moment of supreme weakness, yet through which salvation is secured. God's name, again, is vindicated. And so it just completely upends this whole paradigm of I must make a name for myself. I must perform and achieve and get people to notice me and put myself on the map, quite literally, in Babel, by making a spectacle of myself, which is what Babel is. And the cross just cuts through that like a scalpel and says that's not how names are made. And the very term Babel, of course, and the way that the Bible plays on that name, and sort of apparently, it meant gate of the gods, but the way that the Bible sort of messes with the name, it ends up meaning confusion, is just another way of making that same point. There's a vanity in this self name making that's really, that evokes pathos, I think. The Christian doesn't read that and think, ha, 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 they got their comeuppance. There's a sadness, there's a great human endeavor and seeking to find meaning. You were talking about the crisis of meaning earlier, that there's a seeking for meaning in the Babylonian project that comes, Ozymandias-like crashing down. And there's a great sadness to that vanity of human achievement. But a great meaningfulness and resounding solidity to the cross compared with the ephemerality of this Babylonian project.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chris. And if I might do one more question before we go, then shall we do it that way? So I think a good one, building upon what you just described, might be to look at Abraham, who was, of course, given a new name, our father in faith, and some of the themes that developed then of promise and covenant. Would you like to speak to any of those points and why that's important?
I'd love to. Yeah. It's a very exciting part of the Bible, isn't it? Isn't it outrageous that a God who made the universe and upholds the whole universe in being, second by second, by the word of his power, as Hebrews says, would condescend to bind himself in a covenant with one human being, and not a particularly noble human being at that, a human being who used to be an idol worshipper and who betrays his sister and tries to sell her down the river and has a lot of problem believing the promises that God makes to him from time to time. That God would covenant with Abraham in this, what that the historians tell us is the model of a suzerain vassal treaty, a very solemn treaty where in Genesis 15, where God cuts in Abraham's dream, God cuts the animals in half and then walks down the middle. Apparently, those who study these things tell us that the symbolism of that is that, God himself is saying, may I be cut to pieces like these animals if I do not keep my word to you, Abraham. It's astonishing. Like, what God does that? What other God of the ancient world, or what modern idol would ever debase themselves by doing a thing like that with a creature, someone that they made? And the idea of a God who covenants with human beings through Abraham, I think is paradigm making for the way that Christians understand so much of reality. I think it structures time, actually, because it creates a duration between promise and fulfillment that makes sense of time, makes time meaningful, and makes time linear as well. You know, a lot of ancient cultures had notions of time where things return cyclically. Not in the Bible. You know, there are cycles within the fulfillment of God's promises, but fundamentally, things happen once. God makes promises and then he keeps them. He promises that the offspring of Eve will crush the serpent, and then Christ comes, and he comes once. You know, 1 Peter 3:18, Christ died once for all. So the covenant, I think, is fundamental to our way of, to use Jamie Smith's lovely term, our way of inhabiting time. But it also makes the world meaningful. You know, if God didn't keep his promises, if he said one thing one day and then did another thing, there'd be no way to plan, really, in a very fundamental sense, not just in, you know, today I'm going to go and do this, do that, but in a real sort of existential sense, that there'd be no meaningfulness to planning, because you could never know what reality would do to you one day after another. And it also gives, I think, a paradigm for social relations, you know, if you want to get down to the social level as well, that God sets a pattern for a reality which can be navigated on the basis of promises. And I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. There's nothing inherent, certainly in human beings, that means we are obligated to keep our promises. But I think, you know, if we serve a covenant making and a covenant keeping God, and see how highly he values the keeping of promises that we make, I think that is an extremely healthy and robust basis on which to build meaningful social relationships, both, you know, on an individual level, but also on a social and institutional level. If people can't be trusted to keep promises, it's really hard to build a healthy society. And perhaps this is partly what we're seeing in the rise of litigation and insurance, and the idea that, you know, contracts are moves in a game rather than a sort of a final resting place. If it becomes propitious for me to break my contract, if I gain more by doing so than I lose, then well, of course, that's a no-brainer. I would do that because I gain that way. But that's not the biblical pattern. You know, God does not gain by covenanting with Abraham. He dies, doesn't he? You know, that's not a wise business deal. He didn't do the profit cost benefit analysis on that one. You know, he wouldn't be a good CEO, would he? God. But thank goodness that he wouldn't, because, you know, a reality that is built upon the radical commitment of covenant, I think, is a much healthier and a much more exciting reality to be part of than one that's built on the shifting sands of convenient, expedient contract making.
Oh man, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Chris, and most important, thank you for your time today. And I suppose I lied, as or I have one more question. Where can viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work then?
That's okay. You can ask a little one like that. I'll let you on. I've got a website called thinkingthroughthebible, all one word.com, where I've got a bunch of talks and seminars and resources from a Christian point of view that I've created in the past. And if people want to check me out on Twitter, it's at Dr. for Dr. Chris Watkin.
Thank you so much. God bless you, Chris.
Lovely. Marcus, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there.